So welcome and good morning, and thanks to each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today for our 2022 annual Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance Partners Meeting. For those who don't know me, I'm Scott Nomnicacus. I'm the botanist with the Indiana Natural Heritage Data Center at the DNR Division of Nature Preserves, and I'm serving as the coordinator for the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance currently. Some of you I know are part of our organizational committee, and you've been involved since we first had the idea of forming a plant conservation alliance here in Indiana. And others of you have been involved with our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance through our committees or as members of our plant species conservation teams. And for some of you, this is your very first Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance meeting. And we're extremely happy to have each and every one of you here with us today and excited to share what our Plant Conservation Alliance has been up to and have a couple of presentations that we hope that you'll find interesting and relevant to the work that we're doing. So I see that people are typing their names into the chat. I'll add mine here real quick. And I want you to, as we get started here, I want you to take a second and scroll through that list of attendees. And as you do that, you're going to see names of people who are your friends and your acquaintances. Maybe some of them you haven't seen or talked to in a while because we've been virtual. You're going to see some of your professors, possibly, or some of your former professors, botany professors especially. And you might even see people that you consider Indiana botanical legends in that list. We have a really fantastic and wonderful botanical community here in Indiana. And I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to bring us all together today for the purpose of conserving Indiana's rare plants. Can we start the screen share, Alice? All right. All right, great. And let's see, are you able to give me control of that? Perfect. All right. Okay, the mission of the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance is collaborating to conserve Indiana's rare plants and their natural habitats. And so that's why we're all here today. We're working together towards the conservation of these rare plants. The Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance is not part of the DNR. It's not an offshoot of the Nature Conservancy or any other organization. We really are an alliance of a number of different partner organizations. And you'll see some of those partners listed here. These are all of our partners who have provided us with their logo. As you look through that list of partners, you're going to see consultants represented. You're going to see members of academia in that list. You're going to see state and federal government, nonprofits and land trusts, botanical gardens. All of these organizations are working together towards our common goal of conserving Indiana's rarest plants. And we'd love to have to formally add additional partners to our list of partners. So if you're looking at this image with all of our partners' logos on here, and you don't see your organization represented, and you think that you would like to be a formal partner of the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance, we welcome you and encourage you to send your organization's logo to me, and we'll get that up on our webpage and formally recognize you as one of the partners working together towards conservation of Indiana's rare plants. I want to go through the agenda really briefly here, just to give an idea of what to expect in today's meeting. Very shortly here, we're going to get into our invited speakers. We had invited 3 speakers to speak to our group today. Unfortunately, as I'll mention shortly, one of them, Jennifer Ceska, was not able to be here today. But we will have presentations from Dr. Rebecca Dolan on the importance of genetics in reintroductions of rare plants. And we'll have a presentation from Rich Hawksworth on his experiences with rare plants in the home landscape. And we're really looking forward to both of those presentations. Following those, there'll be a chance for questions. So we won't have questions necessarily during their presentations, but hold on to your questions. And after both of those presentations, there'll be a breakout session where you can go either to Rebecca Dolan's room or to Rich Hawksworth's room and have additional discussion and ask your questions there. That'll be about 15 minutes, and then we'll probably give a couple of minutes as additional time so that you can take a quick break before we move on to our next session. That next session is going to be updates from each of our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance species conservation team leads. So we'll hear, we split the state into 7 regions and are focusing on 1 or 2 species in each of those regions for plant conservation efforts. And so we'll hear from Eric Bird, who's leading the Meads Milkweed team, from Stuart Orr, talking about our Hills Thistle team. Nathan Herbert is going to talk about our Kittentails team and what they've been up to. Gus Nyberg will give an update on our Virginia Bunchflower team and all the work that they've done so far. Dawn Slack is leading our Green Star Sedge team. She's not able to be here today, so I'll sit in for her and give an update on our Green Star Sedge conservation team. Wyatt Williams has taken on the Striped Gentian team, and he'll give an update on what they have been up to. And Mike Everidge is our overachiever. He's leading 2 teams, the Deems Beard Tongue team and the Blue Monk's Hood team, and he'll give updates on both of those. Following, and those are going to be pretty brief updates on each of those species conservation efforts that we've had so far. Following those, we will have another breakout session where you can join one of those rooms and speak directly with that presenter and that species team lead. If you have any questions, or if you're interested in joining that team, or if you just are more interested in that species, feel free to join that team. We'll have about 15 minutes for discussion, and then another break if you need that before we come back for our last session. And then our final session, oops, jumped ahead there. Our final session is going to be updates from some of our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance committee chairs. So once we started the Plant Conservation Alliance, we started a number of committees, and we're going to have updates from Ellen Jacart on our website committee, an update from our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion committee from Betsy and Koyak to let us know what they've been up to. Elisa Nyberg is going to talk about our Growers and Gardens committee and what they've been up to as well. Our Rare Plant Species Profiles Committee has been led by Teresa Clark, and she'll give an update on that committee. We'll have a brief update from Tom Swinford on our Seed Mixes for Solar Committee. And then I'll give a quick update on our Rare Plant Species Augmentation and Reintroduction Guidelines Committee and what we've been up to and where we're going. Dawn Slack was then going to talk about our conservation ethic and confidentiality clause. Since Dawn isn't able to be here today, I will sit in for her and give an update on where that stands currently, and then we'll wrap up. And we're going to do our best to stay on schedule. I'm thinking we'll probably be able to wrap up a little bit before noon Eastern or 11 Central time. But we do ask our speakers to try to stay on schedule as much as possible. We do have a little bit of wiggle room with one of our speakers not being here. So I think we'll be fine on time, but we do ask that we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So please try to stay on schedule with your presentations. So with that, I think we're going to move to our invited speakers. And our first invited speaker, as I mentioned, was going to be Jennifer Ceska. And unfortunately, Jennifer can't be here today, but Jennifer is going to record her presentation, and we're going to put that on our webpage following the meeting. And I really do encourage you to take a look at that at some point. I still wanted to introduce Jennifer in large part because without Jennifer, our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance definitely would not be where it is today and may not exist at all. When we first threw around the idea of starting a Plant Conservation Alliance, Jennifer Ceska's name came up a number of times as the chair or the coordinator of the Conservation Alliance in Georgia. And so we contacted Jennifer, and Jennifer was extremely gracious with her time and encouraging for our group, and gave us ideas of what they had done. she told us that the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance, for the first 5 or so years, didn't really have any movement. They formed and they didn't make much progress. So Jennifer was extremely encouraging of our group and complimentary of our group as we've moved forward in just a short amount of time. So I do want to introduce Jennifer and then have you take a look at her presentation after the fact on our webpage once the meeting is posted there. So Jennifer is accredited public service and outreach faculty at the University of Georgia and has been the conservation coordinator in the science and conservation program of the State Botanical Garden of Georgia for 26 years. Jennifer's specialty is fostering project-driven networks of colleagues who work together on the restoration of endangered plant species and communities. While serving as project manager for the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance, Jennifer also coordinates the Georgia Native Plant Initiative for native plant materials development, the Georgia Milkweed Initiative for ethically and locally sourced Asclepius for monarch recovery, and the Piedmont Prairie Program in Georgia for restoration of grasslands and rights-of-way, old fields, and pocket prairies towards biodiversity. And Jennifer did send a quick note with her regards. She said, "Please share my best regards to your PCA. You all inspire us with your thoughtful approach and steady movement forward. You all are doing this." So we did want to thank Jennifer and still acknowledge her and hope that you will take a look at that presentation on our webpage once it's there. With that, we'll move to our next invited speaker, who is Dr. Rebecca Dolan. Dr. Rebecca Dolan has a PhD in botany and was a professor and the director of the Friesner Herbarium at Butler University for over 30 years until a recent, well-earned retirement. Becky has authored over 35 scientific articles on restoration ecology, urban botany, and genetics of rare plants. Much of the genetic work that Becky has conducted focused on plants of the Lake Wales Ridge in central Florida. Becky is past president of both the Indiana Academy of Science and the Indiana Native Plant Society. So let's welcome Dr. Rebecca Dolan.
Hey, thank you, Scott. And hello, everyone. Lots of old friends and some new ones that I recognized out there. Well, when Scott asked me to give this talk in 15 minutes on a really broad topic to a diverse audience, I was a bit stymied on how to start. And then I got an inspiration. And so we'll see how it goes. It may be brilliant, it may be lame. You guys will be the judge. We're going to start with a hypothetical rare plant to illustrate some of the concepts and concerns related to genetics in terms of rare plant reintroduction and augmentation specifically. So we're going to start with a hypothetical rare plant, which I have named, so I'm the authority, Scotus nomnicacus. And as it turns out, Scotus is a monotypic genus, so we'll be able to just refer to it by its genus name. And I am going to use these cartoon avatars to represent members of the species. So this blue flowered morph represents some of the genetic variation present in the species, but there's a lot of other genetic variation that will represent with these other flower color morphs in the gene pool of Scotus. When we consider how the genetic variation in the gene pool of this species is distributed across the landscape, this is referred to as the genetic structure. And I'm going to illustrate again with these cartoons a couple of extremes about how that genetic variation could be distributed across the landscape that would be relevant to consider when thinking about rare plant reintroductions or augmentations. And of course, genetic variation is an important resource for all species. It's the raw material to be drawn on for environmental adaptation and for long-term evolutionary change. So in these diagrams, the little puddles represent ranges of populations. And in this slide, most of the variation exists within populations. You could compare that to another possible extreme where the genetic variation is structured in such a way that most of the variation exists among, or I prefer to use the word between populations. Now, how this is relevant, of course, depends on, in part, on how the genetic variation is structured will impact choice of source populations. So ideally, you'd want some information about how the genetic variation of your target plant, or in our case here, Scotus, is structured across the landscape in order to inform choices of source populations. Because if we have a pattern of genetic structure like this, source populations, any one of them has in it all of the variation that we're representing with these little cartoons. But if your population structure is more like this, then choosing from this one source population would only capture the genetic variation present in these blue flower morphs. More realistic kind of depictions of the genetic structure of a lot of species would be more like this diagram, where most of the genetic variation is found in the center of a species distribution. And as you get populations out towards the periphery, there is less genetic variation present. So if you want to choose a population that is geographically closest to your reintroduction site, in this case, it would be missing a lot of the genetic variation that's present in the populations that are in the center of the species range. So there's a balance to be considered between representing, the very local gene pool and locally adapted genotypes versus creating new broadly diverse populations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. So the goal, of course, in the aspect of rare plant reintroduction that I'm speaking about today is to create healthy reintroduced or augmented populations that would be wild populations that would reproduce on their own. And in this case, with our Scotus, I think it's a member of the Asteraceae. We would hope to be having seed production and then seedling establishment. So we want healthy populations that don't require a lot of continuing maintenance, that are able to self-sustain and perpetuate on their own, because we don't want to be doing this, we don't want to be doing this, and you certainly don't want me out there doing this. What we want is self-sustainable populations that are run by nature, right, that attract pollinators and other mutualists so that we can get seed set, so that we can get seedling establishment, and the populations are self-sustainable. So information about the genetic structure of species can help inform decisions on choosing source populations. And traditionally, back in the day, common garden or reciprocal transplant studies were done to infer what those patterns of genetic variation might be. But these days, more common are lab-based genetic studies that can use markers to help describe patterns of distributions of genetic variation. And of course, these take a lot of time and money, but in the long run, to achieve our goals of sustainable populations, it's likely to save money. And it's a good opportunity for collaboration. And I think maybe this is one service that our organization can provide to help link up field practitioners with academics. And throughout my career, I had good success with this for long-term collaboration with my former colleague at Butler, Eric Mingus, who moved to Florida. And there, he and his field team did the field work with the plants in a poisonous snake and lightning strike infested field environment. And they mailed the leaves of rare plants that they collected to me in my lab in Indianapolis at Butler, and students and I did genetic analyses there. And in that work, we weren't so much looking at reestablishing populations as in trying to prioritize populations for preservation based on the level of genetic variation present in them and what they contributed to the species as a whole. I also worked briefly with Alan in the last couple of years of my career with Bessia bullii, trying to find genetic markers that would be helpful for work with TNC and state agencies there, but our short look into that species at that time, we didn't find good candidate markers. But I think there are good opportunities here for collaboration. So the Center for Plant Conservation has a great website with advice on these sorts of studies. And they have a list of situations where they suggest genetic studies are advisable before collecting the rare species or conducting the reintroduction, if the wild populations have any of the following characteristics. And I think you'll find that most of our rare plants that we're working with in Indiana have at least one of these characteristics. So if a population has fewer than 50 individuals flowering and setting fruit, if the species is clonal, if there's little or no seed set, or if there are, taxonomic concerns. Across the species range, if the species is declining or little is known about its biology or life history, if it has highly fragmented or isolated populations, if it looks different in different locations, or has distinct ecology, some populations. So the reason that knowing something about the life history of the plant, or a lot about it, can be helpful is that in lieu of genetic studies, you can take some other approaches. And one is to inform choices based on life history information on the target species. The other is perhaps you could look at information on closely related species. You can choose seed from ecologically similar populations, assuming that they're likely to have similar ecotypes. And another approach is to just collect adequate numbers of seeds and outplant sufficient individuals to overcome possible bottlenecks or demographic uncertainty. And it's often suggested to have a target of 50 individuals. The relevant life history information that you'd want to know about plants includes the breeding system, right? Whether it's dioecious or not, you wouldn't want to outplant a whole population of male plants, for example. The clonality and the likelihood of interpopulation gene flow based on pollinators and seed dispersal methods. A couple of other concerns or issues to be aware of is that in plant populations, just like humans and other animals, if too much mating occurs between closely related individuals, then you can get inbreeding depression, which reduces vigor and fitness. But kind of counterintuitively, you also can get outbreeding depression if you have mating between two distantly related individuals, because you could disrupt kind of co-adapted gene complexes. So you seek a balance between representing the local gene pool with that of creating new broadly diverse populations. And genetic studies can help you make those choices. And in the absence of genetic studies, there is a good paper by Franken that presents a decision tree for using kind of non-genetic information about populations to see if inbreeding or outbreeding depression would be likely to be a concern. Of course, you want to do no harm to your source population. You don't want to reduce its genetic variation by collecting seeds or individuals. And I have read a rule of thumb, and I don't know how often this would apply to our rare plants in Indiana, but said that if a population had 750 or more individuals, that it was sustainable to collect 10% of the seed in the population each year. This brings to mind another point, which is that often in plant reintroductions, of course, we're collecting material from a source population. Then it goes to garden or greenhouse for propagation and then out planted. And genetic variation can be lost at each step along the way here. And with colleagues, hi, Andy Schnabel, I saw you were on the call. Andy Schnabel and Debmar, a number of years ago now, we studied this process going on at Kankakee Sands. So we were looking at prairie plants for the restorations there, and found that indeed, because of the sampling effect, variation is lost at each step along the way for 3 of the 4 species that we looked at. So a couple of take-home messages that I'm going to read off these slides, and then you guys can look back at them later if you want to. And these come from augmentation guidelines, genetic considerations that Jordan Marshall and I have been developing for this group. So it is generally important to use genetically diverse individuals to ensure successful establishment. That genetic diversity should optimally be similar, right, between the source and the target populations, as should the ecological conditions. To the extent possible, patterns of the distribution of genetic variation within and between species, that is the genetic structure, should match that of naturally occurring populations of the species. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately, for designing plans for rare plant reintroductions. Optimal plans for any given species are debatable, but some approaches are less likely to succeed than others. And finally, this words of wisdom from Jordan: as with all aspects of the reintroduction and augmentation process, if sufficient individuals cannot be outplanted, or if population genetic structure cannot be maintained, other management, preservation, or protection actions may be more appropriate. Okay, so thank you, and I'll be at the breakout session in a little bit.
Thank you very much, Becky. That was fantastic for such a short amount of time, and something definitely for our species conservation teams to keep in mind as they're planning what types of conservation activities they want to implement for their given species. I hope that that specific epithet is never one that anyone has to try to say, because it does not roll off the tongue.
All right.
All right, well, as Becky mentioned, she'll be available in her breakout room for any questions or comments or discussion about that topic. And I hope that that some of you are interested in joining that and participating and getting more information from Becky. So we'll now move to our next invited speaker. And if we want to bring up that presentation. Our next speaker is going to be Rich Hawksworth. Rich moved to the Indiana Dunes region 15 years ago and quickly began restoring the native vegetation on a 1-acre property, an experience that encouraged a deep appreciation for the local flora and sparked a keen interest in rare plants and their conservation. Today, Rich is an amateur naturalist, botany enthusiast, and proprietor of Special Vegetation, a boutique nursery that specializes in the propagation and production of hardy orchids and other choice companion plants. Rich has turned the landscape surrounding the Hawksworth home into a living laboratory where a range of species native to northern Indiana can be grown and observed. Please welcome Rich Hawksworth. And there's your presentation, Rich. Take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Scott. Well, there we go. This looks like it's going to be easier than I thought. Well, thanks for inviting me. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences. And I have to admit that it's a little bit intimidating as I scroll through the list of everyone who's participating today, because there's a lot of folks that I don't know, but also a lot of folks that I do know, if not personally, then by reputation, and quite a few of them have contributed to my knowledge of native plants. Just to clarify, I'm not an expert or an academic by any means, but I have learned a few things through my hands-on work with native plants. I do like to get out in the field as much as I can, and based on where we live, it's pretty easy to find some cool natural areas. But that said, having plants here in the home landscape and being able to observe them year-round at close range throughout their life history has proven to be very valuable. And I think I've learned a few things over the years that perhaps wouldn't have been evident had I limited my work to just being out in the field. So first of all, I'd like to take just a second and there we go. Talked about where I live, because it's really been foundational to my interest in native plants, and how I've been able to learn a little bit and apply that to restoration work here in the town where I live, but also hopefully expand it a little bit beyond that range at some point. I live in a town called Dune Acres, which is up in the northern part of the state. We are an inholding, I guess you call it, within the Indiana Dunes National Park. And I say we because I've been on the town council here for about 10 years now. And as a result of that, I manage about 200 acres of dunes habitat, varying dunes habitat, wetlands and uplands and so forth. As Scott said, I wasn't a native plant enthusiast when I moved here, but it's pretty tough not to get drawn in when you're surrounded by the dunes. If you had come to this region 100 years ago to botanize, as so many did, you would have noted your voucher specimens with the place name Mineral Springs. And because of the work of Henry Coles and many, many others, Mineral Springs was something of a mecca for pioneering botanists, and it remains so today. As a result of that, we have a very comprehensive record of which species grew here over the last century and a half or so. And that's been formative for me, not only being surrounded by an abundance of really, really great natural areas to see and to visit, but being able to imagine or perhaps reimagine what this place was like a century ago when it was at a peak. In 1990, Jerry Wilhelm submitted a report to the National Park Service, and he characterized what he referred to as the Dune Acres survey area as a leviathan among natural areas. And I'll quote just a couple of his findings here. In the 22 county Chicago region, which occupies more than 7 million acres, and that's from southern Wisconsin around the tip of Lake Michigan to southwest Michigan. There are 1,500 or roughly 1,500 plant species. About 700 of these have been recorded in and around Dune Acres, which is an area of just 1,000 acres. Wilhelm noted 165 conservative species, highly conservative species, which he referred to as special vegetation elements. And that reference, of course, is I kind of borrowed on that when I named my nursery Special Vegetation. And for whatever reason, maybe just my obsessive compulsive nature, I became interested in growing and learning more about these conservative species. One of the benefits, I think, of growing rare plants and having them in the home landscape, aside from the aesthetic value of it, is that plants are rare for a reason. Whether it's habitat loss, over collecting, disease, Perhaps they're only rare on a local or regional basis, and they're common, or at least not quite so rare elsewhere. But these are still biological things that are programmed to live and reproduce. So I kind of look at each one as cracking a code, trying to figure out, what makes it tick, and how I can reproduce reproduce the things necessary to make it grow and thrive, and hopefully reproduce, in my home landscape. This next slide, when I talk about conservative species, I won't get too far into the weeds here because I think most of you, know how these are defined. Conservative plant species are intolerant to disturbance, human disturbance at least, and have a high fidelity to intact natural areas. There's also been correlation between conservative species and traits such as slow growth rate, a longer lifespan, and a reliance on the survival of established plants to perpetuate the population. In other words, these, by and large, these are not plants that are producing tons and tons of offspring each year. The plants, if they are longer lived, they depend on these habitats that are increasingly rare for their survival. I've grown a number of plants here, but the very first conservative plant that I kind of dabbled with was the dunes thistle, pitcher's thistle. And we're fortunate enough in town here to have a couple of habitat that support the species. When I moved here, there were only a relatively few number of plants growing in some of these old blowouts along the lake. It's a monocarpic species, as you know, or as many of you know, develops basal foliage for and grows for many years before flowering, bolting, and then producing seed and dying. This life cycle takes about 8 years. So in terms of procuring seed and trying to reintroduce it, that makes it tough to grow at scale. So I found in the home landscape, or at least in a domesticated landscape, where it can be watered occasionally, fertilized and so forth, you can get plants to grow from seed to flower in just a few years, 2 or 3 years, which makes the efforts a little bit easier. Another plant that I've grown falls into a group that is not necessarily doesn't fit the mold of having a long life history. Whoops, excuse me. There we go. This is fame flower. This is a super cool little plant that I became aware of after reading Noel Pavlovic's dissertation on this. It's native to the sandy areas up here in the northern part of the state. A little succulent. It's a perennial plant, but I would characterize it as a short-lived perennial. But it's a wonderful little plant. Grows, excuse me. Anyway, it's a short-lived perennial. The pink flowers are really cool. The neat thing about it, it flowers each day, but only for a brief period in the afternoon, which gives it another common name, which is flower for an hour. A similar species, at least in terms of habit, that I grow here is pale corydalus or corydalus, however it's pronounced. This, I think, has a limited distribution up here and has been described as appearing after fires or controlled burns, what have you. So it does need a little bit of disturbance. I find this one to be, borderline weedy for me, which kind of begs the question with this one, with Talinum and a few others about, connecting their rarity to what I've observed in the home landscape. And I think the best that I come up with is that these, they're early successional species, and our rarest habitats, our stable, high quality habitats are very rare, but so are early successional landscapes because of the way land is managed nowadays. Similar to the pale corydalus, forked blue curls is the same in terms of being very prolific. It's in the mint family, flowers about the same time as the asters do in September, and is a prolific seed setter. So, it's been growing here for a number of years, and I don't really have an active hand in managing it anymore, but it kind of does its own thing. This next species is also early successional, Lactuca hirsuta sanguinea. It's the red hairy lettuce. Now this one, the first three of these early successional plants I introduced to the landscape here. Lactuca hirsuta has been here for as long as I can remember. I did notice looking at Deem's flora that he didn't consider it native to Indiana, but I know it's been found in a number of places. It's grown here. It's been borderline weedy for me because it pops up everywhere. And it really wasn't until Nathaniel Pilla told me that he was going to central Indiana to monitor a population or to survey a population that I realized that it was a significant rare plant. Some of the other plants that I have going on here are rare, I think, because they're at the very edge of their range here in northern Indiana. Cornus canadensis bunchberry used to grow in Coles Bog, which is within walking distance of here. Dean called it fairly common at Coles Bog, but it no longer grows there. What I've discovered is that even though it's relatively easy to grow and it thrives with little input from me, that it doesn't flower and fruit reliably. And I did find one piece of literature that says that it requires low nighttime temperatures in order to set fruit reliably. So my guess is that, if it was fairly common at Coles Bog, that at some point in the last century, the temperatures warmed to the point where it wasn't able to successfully perpetuate itself, and the existing plants there died over time. So anyway, I'm going to do a couple experiments this coming summer where I have some potted plants that I'm going to refrigerate throughout the growing season and see if I can get some better results with them. Aurelia hispida. This is another, it's not a weed here, certainly. It's a very rare plant here. But I was asked by someone if I would be able to propagate this for them. And I was able to procure some seeds from an outfit on the East Coast. And when I started inquiring about seed germination techniques for it, I was told that no one really worked with it out there because it is a weed. And if you look at that picture in the upper right corner there, that was a picture I took out at Acadia National Park several years ago. And that's Aurelia hispida growing in the disturbed area next to a newly laid sidewalk. So it grows prolifically out there. It grows in the full sun and quite aggressively. I think that plant was probably 3 or 4 feet tall there. But anyway, sweet fern is another northern species that I've grown, and I actually think that this plant would have some commercial applications if anyone could learn how to propagate it reliably. It won't get too far into it, but it has really, really complex germination inhibitors. And sweet fern occupies a niche in the successional continuum, I guess. It sets fruit, and those fruit can lay dormant for many decades, or the seeds can lay dormant for many decades until a cataclysmic event like a fire or flood or whatnot encourage it to germinate again. But if you were to harvest seeds and try to germinate them, they're next to impossible. But you'll go out again, if you're out east on Mount Desert Island, this pops up on road cuts and in places like that where there's been heavy disturbance. I am working with the work group here with the Conservation Alliance on Asclepius Mediai, Mead's milkweed. And this is a plant that I was able to get seeds from a lady who owns a native prairie in Kansas. And I was able to germinate them and grow plants to maturity to flowering, as you can see. And this grew pretty easily for me for about 4 or 5 years. And then for some reason, 2 years ago, we had a lot of snow. I think it was the winter of 2019, 2020, and it disappeared from my landscape. So I'm hoping that it reemerges this year, but I don't know. Other species I've grown, upland species. I have several conservative lilies, kittentails, which is a longer story. Kankakee mallow, upland boneset is there in the lower left. Calms lobelia, which I grow in bog gardens here. I've also grown a number of carnivorous plants, and I'm working to propagate pitcher plants and sundews at a commercial scale, because there's quite a niche market for those, and there's also a black market for those that I'd like to be able to undermine. So, which leads me to special vegetation. This picture on the left was, I believe it's from a Shirley Hines Land Trust postcard that was sent out several decades ago. This clump of lady slippers was actually in Dune Acres, and the clump, when I first saw it, was only a few flowering stems compared to what it was back in the, I guess, the 80s. And I became fascinated with the idea of being able to help that species, or more generally lady slipper species, Cypripediums, to be able to propagate them and reintroduce them. I quickly found out that orchids were not very easy to propagate. Orchids produce seed prolifically. A capsule, a Cypripedium capsule might have 6,000 or 8,000 seeds in it or more. They're tiny and dust-like, but they don't have an endosperm. So there's no way for the, they don't use traditional mechanisms to nourish the plant until it can photosynthesize. What it does instead is the seeds form a symbiotic relationship with soil fungi, and that nourishes them until they're able to take care of themselves. The replicating that process in the nursery, I don't think it's been done. It's a qualified statement here. I don't think it's been done successfully by anyone, certainly not on a commercial scale. But a number of decades ago, some bright people did innovate ways of recreating that process in the lab. And it's a technique called micropropagation, which is similar in some ways to tissue culture, but the benefit is that you're germinating from seed rather than from by means of cloning. So you're getting genetically distinct plants as a result, and that result takes, in the case of most lady slippers, 5 years or more to grow from seed to a flowering plant. Some other species, grass pinks, are a little quicker. I actually germinated some grass pinks a year ago, and that third picture, I don't know if you can see it very well, but at 12 months, I had one flowering plant out of about 500. But more typically 2 to 3 years for grass pinks to get them to bloom. Every orchid species is a little bit different when it comes to what it requires to get them to germinate. But we've been successful with a number of the lady slipper species, the large and the small yellow lady slippers, showy lady slippers. For as beautiful as they are relatively easy to propagate with micropropagation techniques. Cypripedium macaulay is relatively easy to propagate, but very difficult to grow. It requires more precise conditions, in the nursery. And then the white lady slipper we've worked with as well. Beyond the lady slippers, we've had success with grass pinks and rose begonia, Galliaris, rattlesnake plantain, several species of spiranthes, and a couple of the fringed orchids, which tend to be a little more challenging to grow. So that's it. I just wanted to share a little bit of what we're doing here. Most of our work, or my work, has been limited to learning and gathering knowledge, but I'm at the stage now where I hope I can apply some of that, in the field. This group, I really applaud its efforts and hope I can contribute to its success moving forward.
Thank you, Rich. We really appreciate you giving us kind of a look into your nursery and your efforts. And speaking here from a place where there's still snow on the ground, it's great to see some pictures of color and conservative native plants. So yeah, we really appreciate you being here, and we're gonna set up a couple of breakout rooms now for participants to join either the breakout room with Becky Dolan or the breakout room with Rich Hawksworth, and we'll have about 15 minutes in there for discussion. Build in your break to that 15 minutes. So I have 9:53 Eastern, 9:54 Eastern right now. Let's do 10:10. So we'll go with 16 minutes, 10:10 Eastern time, 9:10 Central time. We'll come back to this main room. If you don't come back on your own, you'll automatically be pushed back to this room at 10:10. So please go ahead and join one of those breakout rooms now and enjoy some discussion with those two presenters. Thanks. Well, it looks like everybody's back. I know we were in the middle of a discussion, so hopefully Rich and Noel, you can continue that discussion, and anybody who has questions on that can get in touch with Rich or Noel. And I'm sure the same thing was going on in the other room as well. So please do continue those discussions after this meeting as well. All right. So I hope that was useful for everyone, and you got some answers to your questions after seeing those excellent presentations. The next session of our meeting is our updates from our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance species conservation teams. And if we want to bring up the first presentation, our first presenter is going to be Eric Bird, who's going to give us a brief update on the Mead's milkweed species conservation team. So Eric, once your presentation is up, feel free to take over. But Noel, you were in the middle of answering a question, or you want to finish that?
Oh, I was just going to say that the proof in the pudding would be if Rich gets any successful seed production, because the breeding system is a genetic-based, I believe, breeding system for that species. So you would have to ensure you have a lot of representation, possibly from different populations.
And that will be a nice transition to Eric's presentation, because we were talking about Mead's milkweed, in fact. So
while we wait for that, I guess I can introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. I'm Eric Bird. I'm the Stewardship Director for Shirley Hines Land Trust. So we're a land trust up in the Northwest region, Lake Porter, LaPorte, St. Joseph, Stark, and Marshall counties. So we're up in that Lake Michigan, Indiana Dunes kind of region.
I did concur. Oh, I'm sorry.
So our Region 1 group is looking at Mead's milkweed. And we only had our first meeting, I believe, unless I wasn't in the first one, but I believe our first meeting was in just earlier this week to catch up and talk about what our plans are for this species. We have a diverse group of folks, in our region and in our group that sort of represent a little bit of academia, the different land managers and land trusts. We have some great botanists, the folks that you read about in books. So like Scott said, I'm honored to be working with these people, not only on this, but often on projects and partnerships. And we appreciate everybody's interest in conserving these rare species.
Eric,
Yes.
my apologies for interrupting, but you should, if you click
Yeah.
on your mouse, then you should be able to advance your slides.
There we go. Thank you. So in the time that we met, we discussed a little bit about what we kind of already know about this species. There are no populations, no remnant populations right now that we know of in the state. There are extant populations in Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa. There is a nursery population at the Morton Arboretum that's been used to study the species a bit. And it's said, used in other restoration projects or reintroduction projects. There was a historical population in Lake County, Indiana. So that's the very most northwest county we have here, in 1888. So that was sort of our last remnant population identification. But it was introduced in Lake County in 1994. There's some journal papers on that. Noel was very gracious to share a lot of journal articles with us about the species. And Doug is our staff ecologist at Shirley Hines. Doug and I sort of were looking over those things in order to create this. Some of the folks that are in our group have gone out to search for those populations. So a little bit of anecdotal information that in 2020, there were a few of them found, less than 10 individuals. Another person went out there in 2021 and did not find them, but we did discuss that. And I believe Rich kind of brought this up, that it's a little bit of a cryptic species. It might disappear. It might not see it for a couple of years and then it pops up. So we might hope to continue to find that introduced population. Sorry, I keep wanting to click my, there we go. We also, from journal articles and other folks doing research on this, we know some things about the physiology and the location where you might be expected to find the species. It's said to be in the Grand Prairie region, late succession, dry mesic habitat. We do know that it's self-incompatible pollination, and it grows rhizomatously. A lot of the papers discussed about some of the places in Kansas and out in those Grand Prairie regions are hay fields, and they get mowed a lot, so they never really get a chance to flower and seed. So they expect that a lot of the individuals are probably clonal through rhizomes. Some of the experiments that have been done have shown that it can take a really long time to flower, that might be shortened a little bit by growing them in the greenhouse first. So plugs might flower a little bit more quickly than seeds, but that it could take up to 30 years before you're seeing flowers and seeds. So a real long time to maturity. And it seems to be a little bit fire positive. So folks showing that there's increased flowers and seed pods after fire and disturbance like that, which is generally expected with a species like this, right? There is a Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan that talks about some of the actions needed, just general summarizing. And if we look at these kinds of things and think about what we already do or what we try to do as agencies and organizations, and what can we do? Protecting habitat and managing habitat is something we all kind of strive to do in our region through conservation. Increasing the size and number of populations is a little difficult when we don't have populations that are remnant here. Conducting field surveys for new population occurrences or have potential habitat introduction, right? Finding suitable sites. Doing research and management and introduction, maintaining the conservation populations that exist, promoting public understanding. So education and outreach, we all understand, is a big part of what we do in conservation. And then monitoring, reviewing and tracking progress. So in thinking about these kinds of things, just from what I got from the discussions with our group, it seems like some of these are a little bit more reasonable to do in the first couple of years than others. We'll probably be conducting more research on literature papers and doing some field surveys, seeing if we can find that introduced population and start monitoring that a little bit more closely. And just we have a lot of great people in our network, just putting the word out there and trying to do some forays to look for the species in what we can identify as some suitable habitat. So just some general next steps, like I said, reviewing more of the literature. We only had our first meeting, so Noel shared a lot of papers with us and things, so we can go through and have a better understanding of the species before our next meetings. Continue to have meetings and discussions. Initiate a monitoring protocol that we all kind of agree upon and that we can do within our capacities for the introduced species, for the introduced populations. Continue to look for appropriate habitat to either try to find the species or think about suitable habitats for introduction. And since we've got this great team of people together, we might want to consider other species. A lot of us are aware of some really conservative, really rare species populations that are struggling on our sites. Just continue to have some discussions about things that we can do to protect and manage other incredibly conservative species as well. So that's all I really have for right now. And I thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions, or I don't know if we're doing that a little bit more at the end of the program.
Yeah, we will have time for questions in the breakout sessions. If anyone is interested in hearing more about that or asking Eric questions, you can go to that breakout session after we get through all of our priority species updates. I do appreciate you taking that team on, Eric. I appreciate the patience that that team is taking. I think patience is an important thing to remember as we are going through these conservation processes and decisions in terms of what we might want to do for a species. And I think the literature review is a big part of that. In other cases, like you'll hear here coming up with Stewart and Cercium Hilliai, a lot of that work has been done and they are at a later stage of the process. But I think that what you guys are doing so far is great. And I thank you and the team for taking that on.
Yeah, thank you.
So our next brief presentation is going to be from Stuart Orr, and he's going to talk about Hill's thistle and our team who's working on that species. So take it away, Stuart.
All right. Let me see if I can. There we go. Okay, I have control of it. Awesome. All right, so thanks everyone for showing up to the talk. Stuart Orr, I work for the Nature Conservancy. My official title is Fire Manager for the state, but I wear lots, including a big botany hat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the background of the Cercium Hilliai project. It's been ongoing for several years now, but sort of with the formation of the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance, it's really ramped up and we're doing some exciting things. So, okay. So the Cercium Hilliai Working Group is a partnership between Niches Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, and the Indiana DNR Division of Nature Preserves. So a little bit of background on Cercium Hilliai. It's a Midwest endemic. The type specimen is from what is now in Gary, Indiana. It's ranked G3, a globally rare species. It is state endangered in Indiana, and most of the states it's found in, it is state listed of one sort or another. It's found in silt loam prairies, sand prairies, hill prairies, oak barrens, oak savannas, and open woods. There are something like 16 historic records from Indiana. Of all of those, we know of 5 extant populations, and those are the ones we are working with. There's one in the Dune and Swale area, one in the Grand Prairie area, 2 in the Kankakee Sands area, 1 in the Wea Plains, and then the other ecoregion of Indiana that the species historically inhabited, the Pigeon River Sands, it is no longer extant. So reason for its decline, habitat loss, of course, it's a prairie plant. There's almost no prairie left in Indiana. Lack of disturbance, I should also add maybe wrong types of disturbance for the species. And then being a thistle, herbicides were actually probably a pretty big driver of the population decline. So Currently, lack of protection on one population is definitely a threat. And then for the populations that are protected, which are the remaining 4, they have relatively low population numbers on those sites. A little bit about the biology. It's a weird plant. It's partially a monocarpic perennial, but it does have some clonal growth as well. And the clonal growth is becoming a little bit more well known now through some genetic work. It is self-incompatible. It has staggered presentation of pollen versus the stamens on any given capitulum. There's probably some genetic things going on as well. We have done some, the Chicago Botanic Garden has done some genetic work in collaboration with us that indicates there are fewer genetic individuals than number of rosettes would indicate in a given population. So the one dune and swale population and both Kankakee Sands populations have been assessed. And just for an example, at one of the Kankakee Sands sites, there were about 60 rosettes the year that it was assessed, and they consisted of 2 genetic individuals. So really there were only 2 plants at that particular site. Most populations flower infrequently, limiting opportunity for outcrossing and seed production. And as I said, most populations reproduction is clonal. So past conservation efforts. So there's been land protection and management, both historic and ongoing. Some protected populations blinked out anyway. This is possibly due to their just general small size, lack of habitat, and maybe some stochastic event. But there are definitely several historic populations on protected areas that are no longer with us. So more recently, TNC and DNR have been working with the 2 Kankakee Sands ecoregion populations. It's very convenient. They're only about 1.5 miles away from each other. We've been doing annual monitoring as well as a hand pollination, sort of cross pollination between the 2 sites. That ended up not working. We also tried some reciprocal transplants, but because we had so little to work with, we only did, I believe, 10 total, of which 8 have survived. So really not too bad, but there hasn't been much flowering so far. A little bit more recently, we did a lot of investigation of historic locations just to try and look for more material to work with or see if there's any other populations out there that could be protected. Looked at all of the known records and looked at current aerials for those areas. Most of them were pretty grim. You can see a lot of conversion to various other land uses. 5 sites were ground truthed. Population was found extant in a cemetery in the Weah Plains ecoregion. With permission from the township trustee who owns and manages the cemetery, we transplanted 10 rosettes to a common garden sort of future seed production bed at the Kankakee Sands region. And then sort of with the formation of the Cercium Hilliai working group, it sort of meshed really nicely with the project we were starting. So we brought, because the population in the Weah Plains was very close to Niches, well, is in the middle of Niches service area, we approached Niches and they were very enthusiastic about joining the project. So between the 3 organizations, we sort of formed the working group under the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance. The goal of which is to collaborate to augment the genetic diversity of extant Cercium Hilliai populations and reintroduce the species to appropriate conservation lands within historic range to create enough large genetically diverse populations to secure the species future in the state. And so just looking at the regulations for Indiana, we determined in order to get them delisted, we'd need 21 viable populations. And of course, the prairie species in Indiana is always going to be somewhat conservation dependent. There's always going to need to do that land management. A viable population for this species was suggested to be 200 or more individuals. And where we can, if we have a large enough area, we want to create a metapopulation so things can really move across the landscape over time. Large populations, the goal is that these larger populations should have enough genetically diverse individuals flowering at any one time to permit outcrossing and seed production. So Our sort of protocol for this project, sites in each historic ecoregion were ranked for priority for augmentation and reintroduction as sort of like a 1, 2, 3. Due to limited genetic individuals available, we felt that treating all of the extant populations within the state as one potential gene pool was necessary to maximize genetic diversity. They're all relatively close together. The furthest north from the furthest south population is only about 90 miles. So I felt pretty good about that. So for priority 1, which is what we're working on right now, so we want to try and manage as much as possible the Plains cemetery population. And Bob Easter with Niches has been just tirelessly out there for the last 2 years. He essentially took over management of the cemetery to prevent the Hills thistle there from being mowed, which was being mowed every year. And it worked out really well. We've gotten both years a couple ounces of viable seed. The other priority for priority 1 is augment extant protected populations with plant growth from seed. We also want to augment and add additional genetics to the seed production bed that we're establishing. And then to maintain that Plains sort of gene pool, we're reintroducing Sersium hilii to a protected site in the Plains region where it doesn't currently exist. And it's about a little under 5 miles away from that cemetery. So maintaining that population in a permanently protected area. So things we've done so far, 2020, annual monitoring and planning was done. Niches worked with the township trustee and assumed mowing management of the entire cemetery. Sersium hilii plants, having the respite from mowing, flowered prodigiously. Bob was able to collect that seed, and we split it between Niches and TNC, some of which was planted direct sown at that Plains reintroduction site, and some of which Elisa with the Nature Conservancy grew up into quite a few plants for us. And then this year we did monitoring and planning again. Niches continued the cemetery mowing management. More seed was produced, which is great. Plants from the 2020 Plains seed were grown out by the Nature Conservancy and planted out last fall. That should be 2021 in there. 4 of the augmentation sites, so the 4 extant sites that are protected, received about 50 plants each. They were planted adjacent to the extant population, so they would be close enough to cross-pollinate potentially, but far enough apart that we could really have an idea, at least for now, which plants are which. And then the Plains reintroduction site also received about 50 plants, and the Sersium hilii nursery received about 50 plants or so. Future actions, we're going to keep working through our priority sites as propagules become available. We're going to keep up with the monitoring of extant and planted plants, and then we're going to be continuing to partner with the Chicago Botanic Garden. They're actually going to be growing out the Plains seed for us this year. They have a collaborator there, Jeremy Font, who is very good at growing out Sersium hilii. He's one of the main people working on this species. And hopefully we're going to be able to do some additional genetic work as well. So that is what I've got.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was a very informative presentation, and it kind of shows that this is not a short-term process that we form a conservation team and we start planting in the next month, that it does take that research, and you guys have done a great job of going through that process and using past research on the species to get to the point that you are. So thank you for your work on Hills thistle. Our next presenter is Nathan Herbert. And Nathan's going to talk about our recovery efforts on kitten tails. Go ahead, Nathan.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I've been having some mic issues lately.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I'm Nathan Herbert with the Nature Conservancy. I'm working with the kitten tails, the Bessia Buellii working group. Just a little bit of an update where we're at. So Bessia, all the photos here are by Derek Luchik, by the way. Bessia Buellii, let's see, at Fawn River Fen. And this is one of the sites that's under my management in Northeast Indiana as the land steward. When I came on to TNC, we knew that this plant was known to occur at this preserve. Catherine Chi and I went out. She did some doctoral and postdoc research on the plant. We went out around 2011, found fewer than 30 plants on site. And at that point, we started discussing within TNC how to manage the cane in which where the plant grows to avoid, this plant becoming extirpated from the site. We started reducing canopy and woody understory heavily, much more so than we had in the past, by basically girdling mature trees and cutting and coppicing or cutting and treating understory trees as well to just sort of get more sun onto the ground. We started working on cool season grasses as well to open that up. In 2014, we saw, for the first time that I had been with TNC, I saw plants flowering. So we began a yearly monitoring effort in 2014. And in 2021, we have roughly 500 plants on site. So from 2011, finding fewer than 30, I think Catherine and I found 27 or 28 that year. We have approximately 500 plus or minus 25 or 30 plants between 2019 and 2021. Seed has been collected for genetic study. Dr. Dolan mentioned that. They had issues finding markers for this plant. And so some of that seed came back to us and it was returned and germinated by Elisa Nyberg at K-Sans and germinated pretty well. In 2018, 2019, some of those plants were put back into the population at Fawn River Fen. We just had them and had about 80 plants or so each year and figured, well, let's just put them back there. And we now have this sort of captive seed producing population now. I have some plants at the Northeast office as well. So at Fawn River Fen, with site-specific management for the plant, it seems to be doing pretty well. We reduced cool season grass cover by 75% or so. This is what it looked like around 2015. We reduced overhead leaf cover by about 50%. The cane where the plant grows is a pretty nice oak woodland, but it had roughly 100% or 100 plus percent if you count the understory canopy coverage over most of the cane. So we wanted to reduce overhead leaf cover by about 50%, reduce that canopy cover by half and get a lot more sunlight onto the ground. So we go from something like this with a lot of little grubs and resprouts from oaks and a lot of cool season grass cover to something more like this with a lot more open ground, a lot less competition, both vertically and horizontally from other plants. So with the working group where we're at, in 2022, I'm going to continue normal monitoring and management at Fawn River Fen. This year, I was able to get together with some members of the working group. We met at Fawn River Fen, had an introduction to the plant, did a little bit of management work, clearing some understory growth, and just basically familiarized ourselves with the habitat and the plant and the species itself. Started to accumulate a literature database that we can share and get educated on the plant. And so in 2022, we want to continue this, but also importantly, it's time to look at these other historical locations. And so there are only in my database 7 EOs, official EOs, and it looks like 1 renegade planting of Bessia in Indiana. And so I would like to get to as many of these as possible this year. And the most recent one, other than Fawn River Fen, is Weah Creek, Gravel Hill Prairie in Tippecanoe County. That's a high priority to get to there and assess the condition of that site and have a look and see what the plants are doing. I've never been to that site. We have sites in White County and several sites in LaGrange County that are actually within just a few kilometers of Fawn River Fen. So those should not be difficult to visit. One of them is actually recently acquired and added to LaGrange County Parks and managed by Blue Heron and Nate Simon's crew. So it should be pretty easy to get to those sites and see those. And I want to get to some of the more remote sites as well. I think that's our first step, is to, I'm pretty sure we've got a healthy population in Fawn River Fen. I want to see what else we have to work with in the state. And I definitely want to talk to Rich Hawksworth because he's the one that found a plant in, I believe, Porter County, just growing out in the middle of nowhere, showed up on a Facebook group. So I'm curious about that as well. So that's where we're at. We've got good management. We've got good numbers at Fawn River Fen. We want to expand that and look for, assess the other historical locations this year.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That's great. I had no idea that the response at Fawn River Fen was so positive, but that shows that sometimes our conservation efforts may not be planting, they may be habitat improvement and management. And sounds like you guys have done a great job there. So thank you. All right, our next brief species conservation team update will come from Gus Nyberg, and he's going to talk about Virginia bunchflower efforts. Go ahead, Gus.
Great, thanks, Scott. Can you hear me fine?
Yep.
Okay, great. So our group organized for the Virginia bunchflower, and we've had a good coalition of people that we've gotten together via email throughout the year. So just a quick overview. In 2021, there's 5 known locations for the bunchflower in the state of Indiana. 2 of those are confirmed natural sites. One is large and robust, the other one not so much so. Neither one are protected sites, and there are 2 known restoration sites on protected land. This past year, they had 20 and 13 blooms respectively. And another site that came to our attention in the middle of the year that we need to assess out there, and it's of unknown origins. The status for the species is similar throughout the Midwest. Few scattered locations listed as endangered in throughout the whole Midwest region. Both of the restoration sites are on former ag grounds, so they're augmented sites that were, they're in restorations. We have a 10-year restoration goal for the species, which is not to get it delisted, but 6 stable locations in the state, 3 in the eastern half of the state and 3 in the western, using respective genetics from the existing populations that are out there. And we came to a starting number of 20 blooms annually from each population for them to be considered stable going forward. In 2021, we collected seed, or we assessed the populations that were out there. We collected seed from the Idaville site, as well as the eastern location. One thing to pass on about the Idaville site, which is in between a railroad right-of-way and US 24, when it was assessed in the spring, there were isolated individuals from the main clump, which you see a picture of currently, that I was really looking forward to collecting seeds off of. When we went to go collect seeds later in the year, the roadside had been sprayed, and those roughly about 6 individuals that were distinct from this main clone perished, or at least this year's growth. We'll check on them next year to hopefully they'll be there. But it just drives home kind of how fragile sometimes unprotected sites can be for us, and the imperative to try to move forward quickly. Our plans for 2022 are to grow out the seeds that we've collected, continue to assess the seeds sites that we know of, and continue to move the establishment of the plant into protected areas on the landscape, and hopefully one thing to add on this, I guess, just take a step back. Seed production from the eastern population, which had 18 blooms, was far inferior to the larger Idaville site. So whether that's potentially suffering from some inbreeding depression, or whether that just had a bad production year, hopefully we'll be able to kind of start tease that out as we collect seeds from it in next year. So that's really kind of the working group, kind of what we've tackled, and what we will continue to assess populations, as well as working to get those plants in the ground that are being grown by the Chicago Botanic Gardens, and continuing to move forward. So.
Thank you,
Scott.
Gus. Yep, thank you very much. Appreciate your efforts with that species. I've seen the Idaville site, and in addition to it being herbicided, like you mentioned, the habitat quality has declined substantially, just being a roadside, as you know as well. And so that does drive home, as you said, the importance of preserving some of these species. That thing is bare. It's a very rare plant in the state, and it's barely hanging on, it seems like. So really appreciate your efforts towards Virginia bunchflower. All right, our next species is green star sedge, Carex viridistillata. Make sure that this is working here. There we go. All right, so Dawn Slack is leading our Carex viridistillata, our green star sedge team, but Dawn was unable to be here today, so I'm going to be reporting on Dawn's behalf. Even though some people seem to find sedges to be less charismatic than some of our other plants, we have a great team of 6 individuals, including Stuart Orr, Nathan Herbert, Jeff Ray, George Manning, Dawn Slack, who's leading our team, and myself, who have taken on the task of working with green star sedge and the conservation of this species in the state. Carex viridistillata is the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance priority species for Region 5, which is basically East Central Indiana. Our team for this species is really just getting started. We know of 2 places in the state where Carex viridistillata, which is a newly described species, it was described in 2013, where it has existed. And both of these are on private property. The Wabash County population was documented in a collection by Charles Deem. He called it Carex flava at the time, and that was in 1916. That collection was then annotated later in 1937 as Carex cryptolepis. You could tell that there was some confusion as to what this thing actually was, because experts were calling it different things. And eventually it was annotated as Carex viridistillata when the species was being described. Unfortunately, the site hasn't been visited, as far as we know, since 1916. The Henry County population was initially documented as Carex cryptolepis in 1995 when it was discovered. And that was later annotated as Carex viridistillata just before the species was formally described. So those are our 2 known occurrences of this plant in the state. We're trying to arrange visits to both of these sites to be able to collect data on both of the populations if they actually are still both present. We're also conducting a literature review, and then we hope to do some field surveys in appropriate habitat at other locations around the state to search for additional populations that may be out there, especially those that have been called Carex flava or Carex cryptolepis in the past. We want to take a look at some of those and see if maybe Carex viridistillata is hiding out there as one of those. After that, our next steps are going to be determined based on what we find. So we may find that we discover enough populations that this isn't really a priority species anymore. We may find that we need to do some habitat management to improve conditions for some of these species, but we really want to take a patient approach and make sure we're doing all the research ahead of time before we get into the actual restoration activities. If you are interested in joining the Carex viridistillata team, please do contact Dawn Slack, or you can contact me and I'll get you in touch with Dawn. And that's basically where we stand with Carex viridistillata at this point. All right, our next species that we're gonna have a quick presentation about is striped gentian. And let's see if that presentation will pop up. Wyatt Williams is heading up the striped gentian team. So Wyatt, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning. Yeah, we have a pretty similar, we're at a pretty similar stage as the Carrick's team. As you can see, we have some good folks on board, and make sure that this is working correctly. Part of the reason that striped gentian is a priority is if you look at the map, it's no state has it ranked as S5. It's S1 in Indiana and G4 globally. Here's the distribution. We are on the northern end of its range. That the north central Indiana record is, we don't think it's correct. We've only know it from Harrison County, and we've never known it to be abundant here. As you can see, Charles Deem and his wife Stella found it in 2 locations in Harrison County. We have 5 locations that it's ever been known from, 3 known recently. The 2 that it is not known from are the Deem locations, and there have been efforts in the past to relocate it. We'll probably consider looking at those again and trying to discover it. But the 3 known locations have all been surveyed in the last 2 years. Last year, we were only able to find it in 1 location. It was 3 vegetative stems in Harrison Crawford State Forest. That's a photo of it. The year before, we were able to find 1 that was in bud, and the 3rd location hasn't been found since 2014. So we've monitored all of the known locations. We'll probably do that again this fall. It blooms in October. But we really want to find where else it might be hiding. I looked at 4 states' collections on the Consortium of Midwest Herbaria: Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. We kind of pulled out some of the habitat descriptors. By and large, it's found in dry, open forest, sort of barrens type areas. So it would make sense to look there. But if you look at the collections over time, it looks like really recently it's only been discovered in disturbed areas, collected in disturbed areas anyways. So that's where we're at. So there hasn't been a lot of research done specifically on Gentiana villosa. Probably more literature review is needed. But what we're like I said, we're just going to be looking for it more. We want to understand a little bit more about the biology before we dive in and start giving management recommendations. This is a map prepared by Ryan Keller. It has a couple of our known sites and then what he thinks is appropriate habitat. And we're also going to be looking at things like this: power line right-of-ways, roadsides, anywhere where it's sort of been artificially opened up and more sunlight has been allowed to hit. So yeah, like I said, just trying to find out more about it. Dwayne, the manager of Harrison Crawford, is very receptive to helping manage it. And if you want to join, please reach out.
Thanks, Wyatt. Appreciate that. This is it's an interesting species. You know, I searched for it the last couple of years without much luck. And as you looked at that map that Wyatt shared, you see that we are at the very edge of the range, and a lot of times those edge of range populations have important genetics that are worth preserving. So even though it seems like maybe we're at the edge of the range, we shouldn't worry about that species. It definitely is important to the overall distribution of that species and the overall population. So thanks, Wyatt. Our last speaker with a conservation team update is Mike Everidge. And as I mentioned previously, Mike has taken on 2 teams in the southern part of the state. Mike's going to talk about both Deem's beard tongue and blue monkshood. So have at it, Mike.
All right, thank you, Scott. So I'm going to start with Penstem endemii, and much like the last 2 presentations, we are very early in this process. And so what we have here is a historical map. This was taken from Deem's Flora of Indiana. And what you can see is, if you're able to see that, the green are the historic counties that he listed this species to occur in. The darker ones are where they occur today. And to the best of my knowledge, there are no known accounts in the 2 counties currently that he found it in historically. The Marion County record was likely wrong. So this is just an image from Clark County, which Clark County has the most numbers. I remember Gus was talking earlier about roadside spraying, and that is an incredible threat for this species, as it tends to be found almost exclusively along road cuts and roadways. So that will be a problem moving forward. Here's another image. So what we can see is this is really tiny penstemon compared with others. So, and is one of the characteristics to look for in the field. So I looked at these keys, and this is oversimplified. What I found was, for me, this genus is a bit confusing with a fair amount of overlapping characteristics. And really, I was only finding one common characteristic, which was, really small, short sepals. So my question is this indeed its own species? And there's debate on that. So to lump or not to lump. So at this point, we probably need to have some genetic study done. We're also going to be out this spring, early summer, looking for other species, other locations, especially in some areas that aren't on roadsides. Jackson, Washington State Forest and Clark State Forest, I think, are potential places due to logging in the past, maybe even 20 years. So we're currently looking at going into those locations to find it. And of course, then, protection of the species is the highest priority. And with that, I do want to say that Peyton Phelps and Jason Larson are on this team. And should anybody desire to be on the penstemon team, feel free to contact me. Now I'm going to move on to monkshood. And so this one is quite a bit further along, much more like Stewart's thistle. And again, here we have a map taken from Deem, and he didn't have it listed anywhere but Harrison County, and that location was a record from the 1840s. And he verified it was a good record, and I'm sure it is, but that location has never been relocated. And it simply says the Barrens of Indiana. So we're not sure, south of Corydon, we're not really sure where that could be. It's currently found in 2 counties in the southern part of the state. And in this presentation, I will just call them the northern and the southern populations. So as you can see, this is an extremely attractive flower. The foliage is actually nice as well. It's really a striking plant when you get to see it when it does flower. So in the northern population, which has been known since, I believe, the late 90s or maybe the mid 90s, it had not been known to flower at this location prior to 2018. It has a very small area of habitation. It's maybe 500 to 1,000 square feet. I was able to talk with the person that had been there when it was originally found, and he thought there were only about 30 stems. And there's quite a few more now. So after that, after 2018, an overstory maple fell, and it put a lot of light on this exact location. And the following year, there were a few flowers. And to the best of my knowledge, that was the first time anyone had seen this exact population in flower. That may not be right, but that's my understanding. So, and then the following year after that, it went nuts. So it had been sitting there just waiting for this resource. I'm going to guess there were thousands of flowers, at least the upper hundreds. And we were able to collect seeds. We collected about 1,000, and we forwarded those to the Kankakee Sands greenhouse. Alyssa grew out 65 individuals out of about 1,000. So it's clearly not super viable. These were divided between myself and Bill Daniels, who was on the INPCA growers team. And this is Bill planting some of these plugs in the late spring. And this is very near the known population. That a few years earlier had actually had 2 stems located right here, but have never been seen since. So we actually broke 50% of the spicebush stems to give it a little bit more light. And we were out there this fall, and all of them look fine. So I have high hopes for this plant to do well in the future here. So in the southern population, this is a different story. So in 2020, the Forest Service and TNC staff, we went out and looked for historic locations from this area in the southern population known to have had this. We were only able to locate one roadside population, and it was on private ground, which always is a problem, especially in that part of the state. But in 2021, the Forest Service, TNC staff, and Indiana, the Division of Nature Preserves staff, we went out and actually found quite a few more. Only one location, I would call it one location, but there were thousands of stems present, hence the hooping and hollering that took place at that point. So other areas searched that day were not successful. So that's a little bit troubling. That may be the only 2 locations in the southern part of the state. So moving forward, we're going to try to continue, searching out. There's still other recorded areas that we would possibly be able to look for and find this plant. If that's, we now have a good seed source with that large population, and perhaps if it seems accurate and there isn't any found in these other locations, if we can verify more closely the correct locations, we may consider putting some back. We'll just have to observe right now. We're just going to continually monitor at this point. We all feel a lot better about the volume of this plant. And this is the population in the northern area. And as you can see on the right, it's really happy where it's at. And it's just a really beautiful flower. And that's what I've got.
All right, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Appreciate you taking on 2 species, and you're right, they are beautiful flowers on that aconitum, even more so in person, I think, than comes across in images. And Deem's beard tongue is another great one, so I appreciate you working on both of those. So why don't we, the breakout room options are going to come up. Please ignore the rooms that say Becky and Rich. I'm not sure what that is, it just popped up, but please ignore the ones that say Becky and Rich and choose one of the other breakout rooms so that you can join a breakout room with one of our presenters on those species that we are prioritizing for conservation. All right, it looks like we've all been brought back to the main room, best I can tell. So we'll move on to our last segment of the day, and that is our updates from our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance committee chairs. Our first update is going to come from our website committee, and that's going to be provided to us by Ellen Jacart. So Ellen, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Scott. The Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance website is hosted on the Indiana Native Plant Society's website, which is indiananativeplants.org. And I have to give a huge thanks to our webmaster, Wendy Ford, who has been really making these pages come to life. We're up on the quick finder right now, but if we're not there, Advocacy Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance, when you go to that page, you'll see this is our main page. The right, or there's a left column and right column. Left column has basic information about the Alliance and what we're doing. If you continue to go down, there's a list of all of these committees that you're going to hear from and more, with the email contacts for all the committees. One of the committees, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, actually has a hyperlink because they have their own page and content with what they're doing and all of their committee members with contacts. And then on the right bar, we have all those partner logos that Scott showed earlier. And in the upper right, we have the current projects that we're working on. One of them is hyperlinked, and that's the priority species conservation, which you've been hearing about, all the great projects from the team leads. This has the information on how those species were chosen, the list of each of the priority and backup priority species for each of the geographical regions, and then a summary of all the progress that's being made with the species. And that's everything.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks to Wendy Ford as well for her assistance. If you don't know Wendy, Wendy does everything. She's a huge part of the Indiana Native Plant Society, and she's really helping us out with the webpage as well. Thanks, Ellen. Our next committee update will be given by Betsy Ankowiak, and that is our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Betsy, if you're talking, you're muted. We can't hear you yet. Okay, I can see you. Are we able to unmute Betsy, Alice, by chance? Boy, we made it this far without too many technical difficulties, and we finally, she says it's her.
Yes. Well, Betsy, can you tell us your problem, and is it that we cannot hear her?
Yes, she shows as muted.
Okay.
To me. I'm wondering if she may want to drop out and come back in, and we can move on to our next committee and come back to Betsy. Does that make sense?
Give us 1 minute. Give us 1 minute.
Yeah, Betsy, be sure and go down and test your microphone.
She wanted them.
All right, thank you guys so much for that. When I got switched over, I could not find my own mute So thank you very much for your patience. So I'm able to unmute. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
So great. Well, thank you guys so much for the opportunity. I know a lot of times when we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not the easiest topic to talk about. So I definitely appreciate your attention and your time today. You know, Mariah and I, when we heard about this group forming, we really wanted to try to support your efforts. But when you think of rare plants, you usually don't think of Eagle Marsh. And so this is one way that, you know, we can help, you know, and also through the Growers Committee to help out with this program. So thank you so much for your attention. And now slide advancement.
Betsy, if you would click once with your mouse, then use your arrow bar to advance the slides.
Great. So the goal of our INPCA DEI committee is to create an INPCA that okay. So
you can hit the back arrow to go back. Sorry.
No, it's all right. I am.
Click. Now you should be able to go back.
All right, so this is our DEI committee, our committee members, and hopefully I can get back to that next slide. So Mike, Nick, Lydia, Corley, Alyssa, and I have been working at great lengths to bring this presentation to you today.
I'm sorry, Betsy, tell me which slide you want and we'll get you there.
All right, if we could go back a slide, that'd be great. So the goal of our committee is to create an INPCA in which all members have an equal voice in the conversation, no matter their gender identity, sexual preference, age, experience, or the color of their skin. This group will be stronger if we all feel comfortable and confident that our opinions and actions are valued, even if we can't use a PowerPoint. And we would also like to bring a greater diversity of voices to this group. Okay, and then we can forward 2 slides. Great. So the first step that we decided to do was create a survey for our members. So in June, we distributed a 10-question survey through SurveyMonkey. We had 37 members of the 72 that we had at the time contribute and respond to our survey. And so thank you for those 37 folks. So, so since we only had 37 respond, we need to know that there is definitely bias in these results. We could forward. So why we did it and what we will do with this information. So the reason for this survey was to create a baseline for our group's understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to gather information from our members about what communities we want to actively engage with, our mission, and to understand if our members' needs, including accommodations to participate in our events and programs. And then also, we would like you to know you can anticipate an annual survey to monitor our progress. Forward. Great. So our first question was, how familiar familiar are you with the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion? And as you can see, over 50% of our group feels somewhat or extremely comfortable with the terms diversity and equity and inclusion. Next. So so is DEI a comfortable topic for you? I think this was good news because about 40% of our community feel somewhat comfortable or very comfortable. I definitely appreciate the folks that answered as mildly uncomfortable, because I would have put myself in that same category before a year ago, before I started diving into these topics. Next. So do you have any suggestions on how INPCA can be an inclusive organization? And I think foremost is just being aware and respectful to each other while we're communicating about our different thoughts about genetics or what we're doing with augmentation or anything like that. Just be respectful to each other. We want to reach out to underserved communities, minority groups, add diversity to our leadership. We are very proud of the INPCA leadership and the role that they're taking in adding this discussion into the group. Partner with organizations with high racial diversity, work on groups that are in the outdoors, and speakers and events can be outside of our typical circle. We can use our academic connections and make sure we have accessible programs and use a common language. And then we really want to convey the intention of INPCA is to be inclusive. So are there other groups that you believe we should reach out to in order to help INPCA build a diverse coalition to protect our state's imperiled plant species? And so you can see there's a great number of things, from small groups like garden clubs to TNC, to indigenous groups, to students, from economists to elected officials and government agencies. So there is a great deal of information that we're able to gather from our members. So do you have any special needs that you would like to make us aware of so we can make every effort to support you and or others as a member of INPCA? And we got a couple responses. First is just being cognizant of all of us in this group. Maybe they are not easy to respond in a group setting, but they might be better off in responding by email or other ways of communication. So not everybody is comfortable speaking in large groups. And also to ensure we are reaching audiences that might not communicate electronically. And I think when we start talking about working with private landowners that have these rare plants on their properties, really working with those that protect natural areas is really important, because they have decades of experience working with landowners and building those relationships slowly. Because DEI and this Native Plant Coalition, it's really about building these relationships from our understanding of these plants with each other. So what types of resources can we provide you to best support you as a member of INPCA? So be diverse when, where, and how we host our meetings, events, and programs. So I just want to relate to this picture here. This is an autism group. And within our autism group, we have somebody in a walker, we have folks that are blind. And so accommodating this group in a seed gathering activity that is, very accessible along our driveway. So accommodating the greatest amount of people that we can. So there was a request that we make videos available online after events for people to be informed if they cannot make meetings. And then also a clear understanding of any terms used to describe the conservation work we want to accomplish. Being sensitive to others' experience and skill levels so no one feels excluded. Next. And then we did make an optional question if you wanted to respond to give us some demographic information. We had 14 responded to 37. Ages ranged from 23 to 75. 4 females, 7 males, and 3 did not answer. No language but besides English was reported. No one mentioned a sexual preference. 8 mentioned being white, Caucasian, or of European descent. 1 mentioned Latino, 1 mentioned Hispanic, 1 mentioned Catholic, and 1 is retired. So another optional question was to list your name and your email, and then we could reach out to you with any further questions or about their answers to the survey. And so to follow up, we did reach out to all 4 contacts. So we also, our last question was just to share any additional thoughts or ideas or suggestions for our team. So we had lots of different responses that thanked us for putting this together. These responses were encouraging to the committee and made our work feel valuable to completing INPCA's mission. There are 2 responses we wanted to share. One is, this is a difficult issue to deal with, and I don't think that I have any real constructive suggestions. I believe diversity and inclusion are important in all aspects of a functional society. Unfortunately, our field is not very diverse, but it also is made up of a very tiny fraction of a % of the population. Well put. And then another one is, I am proud to be part of a nature group that is taking this seriously. Next. So the action steps for INPCA in this committee, but for all of us, always act with kindness and respect. Accessible meetings and information sharing, that should be things to be considered for physical meetings, remote meetings, and access to video recordings. Expand our circle to include diverse stakeholders. Everyone is welcomed into this group. Anonymous platform to share concerns and recommendations that will be added to our website later. And then a website to access our committees and our goals, and anyone can join our committee. So how DEI committee can help you. So give ideas and contacts to include diverse communities. So if you are going out on these field trips for rare plants, maybe you want to partner with another group. Facilitate conservation or conversations and connections within our community. And then just let us know how else we can help you. And Elisa Nyberg is our contact for that. So thank you. The raw data from the survey is available. If you want any information, and please look for our 2022 DEI survey.
Thank you, Betsy. Appreciate you presenting on behalf of the committee, and thanks to everyone on the committee who is shown on the screen currently. And thanks to everyone also who filled out that survey to give us a baseline for where our group stands in terms of DEI. I don't know that we'll have any time for discussion on that right now, but if you do have questions, please contact either Betsy or Elisa, and they can discuss those at the committee level and get back to you. And you can put those questions potentially in the chat, or you can contact them directly. Our next committee that's going to give an update is our Growers and Gardens Committee, and Elisa Nyberg is chairing that committee. So take it away, Elisa.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott, very much. And good morning to everyone. It's just great to spend the morning with everyone. Real quickly, Alice, I'm going to jump in and ask you to please control my slides too. Mine are jumping around, unfortunately. So if we could back up one slide and go back to the first Grower and Gardens Committee. Thank you very much, and I will leave you in control, Alice. So, yep, I'm a member of the Growers and Gardens Committee. And before I get started, I should also thank Mariah Russell from Little River Wetlands Project for graciously putting our presentation together for us. And all the photos that are in our presentation today are from her work. Our Growers and Gardens Committee would only have photos of Zoom meetings, and those are only so fun to look at. But the pictures that she provided in the presentation today are all showing people working with plants, which I think we all feel very wonderful. So thanks again, Mariah, for your work. The members of our committee are Betsy Nickel, Bill Daniels, Chris Fox, Cody Hoff, Jason Fritz, Kevin Tungsvik, Mariah Russell, and Nick Garza, and myself. We have a mission that we came up with, and it is to assist the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance, or INPCA, with the preservation and propagation of Indiana's threatened and endangered plant species. In the scope of our work, we're still, grappling with what we're here to do, but we believe that it's to share information and assist in almost any way possible with the following: seed harvest, seed treatment and storage, plant propagation, ex situ planting, technical advice and recommendations on these plants that we may have experience with, plant materials tracking, and then education and promotion. Perfect. So this past year, we spent some time exploring possible collaborations. In 2021, we sent out an email inquiry to all the members to find out what facilities and resources that they might have available to share with the group, such as greenhouse space or possibly even seed testing. We had 7 respond, and we'll be sending out that email inquiry again after this meeting in early 2022 to see if anybody else wants to chime in on resources that they have for the group. And then we also reached out to some other organizations such as botanical gardens and zoos to see if they're able to assist us in our work. Perfect. And we still have more to do, of course. And in 2022, we plan to look into which of our Indiana's threatened and endangered species are currently being grown in the state of Indiana. And we will also assist the organizational committee of INPCA with exploring ways to track how we work with rare plants, such as where the seeds were harvested from, how those seeds were kept, where they were grown, and then finally where they were planted. So if you'd be interested to join us, we would really love your input. Feel free to reach out to me or anyone on the Grower and Gardens Committee.
Thanks, Elisa. Appreciate your willingness to pull folks together from various different organizations for that purpose of having a Growers and Gardens Committee that can support all the work that we do. All right, our next committee update comes from Teresa Clark, who is representing our Rare Plant Species Profiles Committee. So Teresa, it's all yours.
Thank you. So yes, as Scott said, I am the leader currently of the Rare Plant Profiles Committee, and we also have on the committee Ben Hess from Cardinal, who, although I guess it's Stantec now, Matthew Beatty, Becky Dolan, Marcia Moore, Elisa Nyberg, and Alice Heikens. A very small group, but they are mighty at this point. The impetus for starting this was really to get more information about the rare plants and their vital habitats to use in the planning, choosing, reintroduction attempts or augmentations and habitat enhancements. We were kind of constrained until the Rare Plant Prioritization Committee had gotten through their listing. And once we did that and we had a listing to go with, we kind of started with a short form, that type that had typically been used for advising landowners on how they should take care of the habitat if there was a rare plant already on their site. But as we progressed, we realized that we needed more information and have moved more to the habitat conservation assessment paradigm. While this will be more of a long form, it will provide deep long-term help for the species support, and it'll also include more information such as the life history and the habitat, distribution and abundance of the species, the range-wide status, population biology, threats, where it exists and it's protected and where it's not, any management activities in use or any genetic studies that have been done, current research and monitoring that is currently going on with the species. And so right now there have been a couple of them that have gone through the short form aspect, and there have been a few that have already had full conservation assessments done, either by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or there are some that are on the U.S. Forest Service sites. The link below is a link to give you an idea to where you can find a lot of these conservation assessments that have already been done for different species, to give you an idea of their general idea of what they're like. The link, that page is very hard to find if you go just to the Forest Service website. I've never really been able to find it directly. So if you'd like that link, if you're not going to write it down now and you want me to send it to you, please be sure to contact me afterwards and I can get that out to you. But I think in the future, as we move forward to this, that what we really need is that some help, people to do, whether it is to do research on it or just do specific parts. Like if you are really a habitat person, to study multiple plants to find out, what habitat it is that they require, or to, if you prefer, just to grab a whole species on our list, to grab a whole species and do as much as possible, because it's always easier to build onto a document that started from somebody else than it is to start it brand new. Or you can be the person who takes pieces and parts that other people have done and join it together into a cohesive document. Or you can join our committee and learn more about that. Or you can even volunteer to lead the committee. I am going to be departing from the committee very shortly, so we do need a new leader for it, and we are reaching out to people to join that. And that is where we are at this point in time.
Thanks, Teresa. Appreciate your efforts with that. I do think that these, once they're completed for all of our priority species, are going to be a great resource, both for those teams that are working on those species and potentially for the general public to understand where we're coming from as we're implementing conservation efforts for these species. All right. Next up is Tom Swinford with a quick update on our seed mixes for solar committee. Go ahead, Tom.
I've been aware that solar is coming to Indiana at a large scale, large of a scale we didn't know a year ago, or at least I wasn't informed on. But one way that we thought we might be able to help serve that growing and coming circumstance was to provide seed mixes, regional seed mixes that might be used on solar fields. But there I hit my arrow. Alice, you may have to help me on that. So next, please. The image is Matthew Beatty, new image of Regal Fritillary. Yeah, having a hard time moving forward.
Tom,
yes.
If you would please click your mouse.
Yeah.
Then use your arrow key.
I did that the first time, but then when you went back for me, I forgot to click again. Well, anyways, we knew there was an opportunity. We felt hopefully to provide more prairie type habitats and some support for invertebrates, specifically pollinators, but also hopefully to provide maybe a little connection between public lands where some of these are being sited near to, and potential expansion of habitat for especially invertebrates. There's also been an expectation out there. Solar fields are more green, and there's been some examples widely touted in the press showing wildlife habitat adjacent with solar. So there was sort of an expectation to serve. But this has been an eye-opening 2021 permit activity. We've done permitting and review of 52 solar projects in Indiana. It's, NiSource is phasing out all their coal plants. Indiana has big wide open spaces, and tens of thousands of acres of solar fields are coming. It's been quite eye-opening. DNR Nature Preserves is part of the regulatory process. Okay, yeah, I hit my little arrow. We'll click again and we'll arrow. There we go. So again, that opportunity, perhaps some plant conservation, invertebrate conservation, habitat for many species and taxa, stormwater and hydrology. Again and again, you know, we weren't sure what the opportunity could be, but you know, we were hopeful, and hopefully there could be a complement and an overlap of interest, lowering maintenance and doing some habitat work on these solar fields. And one thing we've heard again, and sort of this minimal, has been, well, it's got to be better than agriculture. And some ways that's been the case, some ways not. So as we move forward into this, we've been learning. So near-term challenges is there's this great urgency. These things are going in at a very large scale across Indiana, and there's sort of the sense of things being overwhelmed as far as even supply of the potential for plants. Much of this is in agriculture, needs to be planted to something, and even turf grass and things, it's far short of meeting the demand of this at this point. So all of the nursery industry would not meet the demand in Indiana at this point. So, and we're all kind of playing catch up. So this goal of regional seed mixes, we had a rather informal group and conversations, basically involved Mark O'Brien, Cardno, now Stantec. He's been very involved in this and working with solar fields and is now. Stuart Orr, the Nature Conservancy, has also been involved prior to Indiana Native Plant Conservation Alliance, and myself and other conversations, and people have supported this for sure. One thing in Indiana is we have no Indiana code regulating vegetation on solar fields. Other states, Minnesota is a big example, has some regulatory oversight of trying to see this. So we talking to the solar fields, there's no onus upon them. There's no regulatory oversight. The height of solar arrays is a big challenge. When they are looking for plants, they want something 30 inches, in many cases 18 inches tall. So that gets the list of available prairie plants very short. Well, short in stature, but also a very short list in a hurry. Maintenance, lots of concerns in the Midwest with woody plants. These things have to be kept clean. We're told by solar folks again and again, first and foremost, these are energy production, and they have a lot of pressure to get this implemented. And maintenance, they're also worried about wildlife. There's an awful lot of wires and infrastructure carrying away energy. They're filled with wire and rows within the solar fields. But some maintenance has become a big issue. They're concerned with woodchucks, groundhogs, dens, things that like to den and dig around them have been an issue already, I guess, in their maintenance. But woody management, also wildland fire, potentially in prairie plantings amongst expensive solar arrays. Another challenge has been the chance for input to process. Many of the site plans have already, the big energy companies have had contractors put together all the leases and site designs and so many things. The work is done, and that's been sort of a barrier we're finding more and more for input into the process. Again, cost too, talked about the availability, but $500 an acre potentially for planting buffer and perimeter areas, even not under the solar arrays, is still viewed as maybe cost prohibitive, not to mention the supply issues. Okay, so as a process, our group, of course, reviewed literature and found what was out there and some interesting stuff. Other states' approach. Minnesota has outstanding guidelines, both on siting, which I'm really starting to focus more on the siting of these plants or production facilities, as well as the management, the vegetation percentages and all those. Minnesota has a lot of great stuff that's being shared and borrowed upon. They've developed some good guidelines. Of course, peers and talking our network here in the Midwest. The Consortium of Midwest Herbarium, Paul Rothrock's baby, has Indiana list with all sorted by ecoregions, really great source of seed mixes and, well, plants that are known from ecoregions. And then there needs to be the work done of finding everything under 18 inches, but environmental conditions also change that. And what's available in nurseries. So that's a big part of the challenge of seed mixes. Purdue, I was not aware, and we weren't aware before we entered into this, has an Indiana solar site pollinator habitat planning scorecard. Again, it's sort of a BMPs for how habitat friendly, how pollinator friendly a facility might be with a scorecard. And it offers some support. So here's the seed mix developed by Stuart Orr for the Kankakee region, Sand Country. And pretty interesting. He's got costs on it. It's approximately 500 an acre, but does include some nice forbs over that flower over 3 seasons, essentially, throughout the growing season, and some graminoid plants as well. So there's a brief run through on sort of where we're at. We still think it's an important way to engage. Right now, it hasn't been highly productive or fruitful, but I think it's important for this group to continue to find a role to play in the solar discussions and providing support where needed. Thank you. Questions later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for, we're all very appreciative of you taking on this task. It's one that, as we've seen, has some challenges, and it's going to take a while for us to get fully implemented into the system, I think, but we appreciate your efforts. All right. I am serving as the chair of the Rare Plant Species Augmentation and Reintroduction Guidelines Committee. So I wanted to briefly share some of our progress that we've made with that committee to date. And you might recognize that plant on the first slide there from Mike's presentation earlier. Our committee is made up of a great group of people. Many of these people you probably know or at least recognize their names, and we have representatives from various different industries. We have representatives from academia, state government, land trusts, and consulting, all serving on our committee. Our goal for the committee is to compile a document to be able to provide to our species conservation teams that can be used to provide guidance for their work, especially when it comes to augmenting or reintroducing populations of rare plants. Our committee met briefly in April 2021 and again in November 2021. During those meetings, we discussed what our augmentation and reintroduction guidelines document should look like, what type of information should be included, and what our next steps would be. I then compiled a rough draft outline for our augmentation and reintroduction guidelines document, and Dawn Slack took it from there and is currently working with that outline to put together a rough draft of the guidelines document. Becky Dolan and Jordan Marshall worked together. Becky mentioned this in her presentation to provide some language for a section within this document on genetic diversity. Once our draft is wrapped up, it's going to go back to the committee to review and provide feedback. And then at that point, once we have a more formal final document, we'll pass that around to the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance partners to take a look at and provide some feedback. We're hoping for that to happen this spring. We'll then compile all the feedback we get from all of our partners, discuss that feedback, and modify our document as necessary. And so hopefully by summer or fall, if we're lucky, maybe by this time next year would be a more reasonable expectation, but we'll have a formal augmentation and reintroduction guidelines document that our species conservation teams can use as they move forward in determining what to do for these given species. So that's a really brief update but I wanted to make sure that everybody, all of our partners understood what this committee was up to and that we do have a plan to have some guidelines for our species reintroduction teams or species conservation teams, sorry. But if you're interested in joining this committee or in otherwise contributing to our document, please feel free to contact me. If you have a specific area of expertise that you think would be important for this augmentation and reintroduction guidelines document, we'd love to hear that and would appreciate any help that we can get. So that's an update from that committee. And this is kind of this last presentation here is kind of a committee of one, I guess we could say. This is our conservation ethic and confidentiality clause. Dawn Slack is heading up this group, and right now it's basically just Dawn that's working on this for us. But she couldn't be here, so I'm filling in for her with this presentation. Confidentiality, when we're dealing with rare plants, of course, is extremely important. And not just because we want to necessarily keep information secret on where these rare plants occur from other people, but because we want to do our best to protect these rare plant species. I think we can all agree, and it's pretty well documented, that native plants are in trouble worldwide, and that we are facing an extinction crisis that's brought on by a number of causes. Things like development and habitat loss, invasive species, disease, climate change, you name it. We realize that restricting access to information about rare plant populations is not always a popular stance, but rare plants that are already at risk for the reasons I just mentioned can be put at even greater risk if we freely give out location information on where they occur due to collectors or poachers, but even due to well-intentioned conservationists and photographers as a result of trampling the rare plants or trampling the area around the rare plants, leading to disturbances that can then be susceptible to invasive species colonization. With that said, there definitely is a balance. There are currently unknown rare plant populations that are being lost because the habitat in which they occur is being neglected because we don't even know that they're there. And sites are being developed where rare plants occur, and we don't know that those rare plants are there. So there definitely is a balance in sharing information on where these rare plants occur and on keeping this information somewhat protected as well. As partners in the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance, we are all responsible for the plant species that we are trying to steward. Through the research that Dawn has done into work that's being done by other plant conservation alliances in other states, we know that accurate and confidential record keeping is one of the most important aspects in rare plant species conservation. Currently, our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance does not have a conservation ethic and confidentiality clause, but we are working on creating something that can be signed by all those that are working with rare plant species to say that they agree to abide by our confidentiality statement. This will allow us to safely share data with relevant Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance partners. Our confidentiality agreement will allow us to release limited information and thus to still be able to protect our rare species and habitats from those who could, even unintentionally or inadvertently, negatively impact them. This agreement will also have a statement that says that we will not collect or otherwise destroy rare plants without a permit. We're still in the very early stages of drafting a confidentiality agreement, but Dawn has researched the work done by other plant conservation alliances, and she's prepared a rough draft, which you can see here. This draft is currently under review by our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance Organizational Committee. We're very aware that there are some items in this document, this draft document, that we still need to address in one way or another. Once we have a version that we're happy with at the organizational committee level, we're going to share that document with all of our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance partners. Feedback from the broader Plant Conservation Alliance will then be discussed and addressed by the organizational committee, and we'll put together a finalized version of this confidentiality agreement that will be disseminated to all of our partners. Again, we know that confidentiality with location information is not always a popular but we do hope that you all understand the need and the importance for such a document to be able to help us protect our rare plants while we are trying to protect them. I did mention here that we had time for questions, but since we are running out of time, I'm going to have to cut that short. And if you do have questions, feel free to contact me directly, or you can contact Dawn Slack, and she would be able to answer those questions for you as well. That's an owl, not a plant. Thanks, Nathaniel. It's a burrowing owl. All right, so that concludes our 2022 Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance annual partners meeting. If anybody has any relevant announcements regarding things like rare plants or Indiana flora or natural communities, job openings even, upcoming conferences, I do invite you now to add those to the chat box, and we'll come back to those and share any of those shortly if there's something that you'd like to announce. In the meantime, I want to thank all of our speakers and presenters today, especially Becky Dolan for an excellent presentation on how genetics can impact our rare plant reintroduction efforts, and Rich Hawksworth for a beautiful presentation on his experience with growing rare plants on his property. I again also want to encourage you to take a look at Jennifer Ceska's presentation once it's been uploaded to our webpage. I think you'll really enjoy that. I want to thank those who are leading our rare plant species conservation teams for their efforts and their dedication for the conservation of Indiana rare plants, and those who are leading our Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance committees for helping to keep us on the right track. A huge and special thanks today go to Alice Hykins for helping to organize our meeting today and providing some technical assistance when we needed it, and especially to Ginger, Gina, and Orion in the Franklin College IT department for their behind the scenes work that was crucial for making our meeting today a reality. And most of all, thanks to each of you as partners of the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance for your interest. And we encourage you to increase your participation with our alliance in any way that you can. We've accomplished an amazing amount as a Plant Conservation Alliance in just 2 years, as you've heard today. At the most basic level, we've formed partnerships that previously did not exist, working across lines and together, including working with some from other states as well. We worked together to narrow down our list of over 400 rare plant species to just a handful that we've prioritized so that we can make a meaningful difference for those few species. We've even formed rare plant species teams to work on real conservation efforts to the point that some of those teams are ready to implement conservation strategies. We've showed that a few people can make a real difference, and I'm very excited to see where this next year might take us. So again, thanks to all of you. With that, were there any announcements that were added to the chat box? Scanning, I don't see any. I do have one. The Indiana Academy of Science annual meeting is coming up on March 26th. That's a Saturday. It's in Indianapolis. I'm the chair of the Plant Systematics and Biodiversity section this year. Colin Hobbs is the vice chair. He'll be taking over next year. And if you're not a member of the Academy of Science, I encourage you to become a member and to join the Plant Systematics and Biodiversity section. We're a great group. A lot of the people who are in this meeting today are represented in that group, where we talk about issues dealing with biodiversity of plants and plant inventory work that's being done, systematics work that's being done. It's really a fun group, and I'd encourage you to join the Academy of Science and to come to that meeting and potentially to present your research at that meeting and future meetings. And again, if you are interested in participating in any of these committees or any of these species conservation teams, we really encourage you to do so, because our Conservation Alliance really is reliant on our partners, and we're an all volunteer organization. We're doing this on our own time, some of us through work, but others totally on their own time, and we can only do as much as our partners will participate in. So we really appreciate any participation you can provide. Alice just brought that link in, so feel free to use that link in the chat to go to our survey. And that's all we've got today. So Somehow we still ran over by 6 minutes. But thank you for your time and your participation. And we really look forward to seeing what next year brings to the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance. Thank you.